If you're into building an electric guitar, you should stay with me. We're at the final stages of building my version of Jimmy Page's '59 Dragon Telecaster. We've pretty much finished the build in the last 6 episodes. We just need to set it up for playing. I'll go through all the steps you need to set up a brand new guitar to your or your player's preferences. So stick around. Let's build a guitar. Hi, I'm Yoav, and this is the Electric Luthier. Today, we'll finish the build of a Tele style guitar we started in the last 6 parts of this series. This is a Telecaster style guitar I've built from scratch, showing you all the steps, tools and techniques I use, and some that I don't. We're nearly there, and the neck relief is already where I want it. We still have to fine-tune the nut, the bridge, the intonation, so let's pick up where we left off. The first check I do involves pressing on the 3rd fret to eliminate the neck and the bridge from the equation, and look at the distance from the 1st fret to the bottom of the strings. This can either be measured with filler gauges or pressed with a finger to estimate it by feel. I'll use 2 methods of assessing the height. The first will be by feel to get the ballpark of the height, and the second will use filler gauges to slot the exact preferred height. You can use just one of them, whichever you feel more comfortable with. I'll also use 3 types of slotting instruments. A professional set of slotting files will set you back between $80 to $100. I'll be using a combination of 2 types of much cheaper files to try and get the desired effect. This one size file with a fairly sharp edge will easily cut into the nut material. However, it's not as comfortable to get the width right, especially for the thicker strings. For the thickness, I use this set of 3 files which have a different thickness for each side. So altogether, they match 6 strings. There are a couple of important principles for getting a properly intonated and non-buzzing nut slot other than the height itself. The first is the angle of the slot from the side view, which will determine the intonation point. Just like the frets, which have their intonation point at the middle of the crown, the nut has its intonation point at the tip closest to the 1st fret. That simply means that the slot itself needs to be sloped down towards the tuners, just like the strings are, with the highest point being at the neck side, not in the middle of the nut and not at the tuner side. The second is the shape of the slot. If the slope is right, there is less importance to how the back or the headstock side of the nut is shaped. But at the front, where the pressure of the string is, you'd want the slot to have the shape and size of the bottom half of the string itself. That means each slot will have a round bottom and the depth of half the string thickness. The nut does not need to be any higher than that, but if it is, you would want the slot to get wider so it doesn't touch the strings and buzz. The same can be said for the back of the slot. Since most of the pressure and the intonation are at the front side of the nut, you can have the back side a bit wider to minimize the friction on the string. Think of a funnel-shaped slot which snugly fits the string at the front. My slots are relatively deep, so I'll either file the top of the nut later, or I make sure the slots are filed in a way that they don't buzz. However, I may need to loosen the strings a bit while working. The downside of this relatively cheap set of slotting files is that the bottom part, which determines the shape of the slot, is flat. The more expensive professional ones actually have a round bottom. To make up for that, I'll file the width of the slot with these ones and then do the final depth and the rounding of the bottom with a sharper single one. For the thinner strings, I may just use the single file. Another option for the rounding of the bottoms of the slots is a set of round files which come at various gauges to fit any string size. If the slot is sloped correctly, you really need them just at the front tip of the nut, just to sculpt it correctly. They kind of work for the thicker strings, but become uncomfortable to work with and less effective for the thinner ones. They're also not very sharp or abrasive as far as files go. When filing, I hold my files at an angle, mimicking the angle and direction of the string, and file a bit every time and check back and forth to see if I've gone far enough. You really want to avoid going too deep. That will either require a fix involving filing and rebuilding or a new nut altogether. The more nuts you've made, and possibly ruined a few, the more you'll be able to get the feel of when you're in the right height by just pressing on the first fret while holding the third. Okay, I got to the point where the height is consistent but still a hair too high for my taste. So I'll use this opportunity for demonstrating another method which is both safe and accurate for filing the slots. I'll need a thickness gauge, which you can find at many automotive related hardware stores for just a few dollars. I start by finding the exact height of my first fret. That is the height I do not want to go under at any cost. I use my fret rocker and stack a couple of gauges to be close to the fret size but thicker than the fret itself. When I slide the rocker and hear and feel a step when coming off the gauges, I know I'm still too thick. I'll switch to a slightly thinner pair and repeat. When the clicking stops, I know I have the correct thickness between this and the last one. So it's time for a little math. If I add the thickness of the two gauges which were too high and get 0.051 inches or 1.28 millimeters, and the lower one is 0.49 inches and 1.23 millimeters, that means my fret is 0.05 inches or 1.255 millimeters. So if I had a 0 fret, this would be its height. This is also the lowest possible height I can have for my nut without buzzing. Now, how much and if at all you want to add to that can be debatable, but the principle and the application will remain the same. If you're aiming for the very minimal possible action, this is it. I will add 0.01 inches, which is 0.25 millimeters, to that, so I'll need a couple of gauges totaling 0.06 inches or 1.5 millimeters. I find the right spacers and slide them under my strings. I hold them down under each fret I'm adjusting and I start filing away. You'll know you've reached the correct height when you start hearing and feeling the file scratching the stainless steel. Now StewMac have a set of gauges, files, and also a nice device that holds it all in place, but it is pricey. I'll link it below in case you're interested. This method is really quite foolproof and will enable you to file without the fear of going too low and ruining the nut. While focusing on the front and critical tip of the nut, I try and also give the back a bit of a widening. When I'm done, I know I have good consistent height for my slots, and I even have a spare 0.01 inches which I could file off if I want even lower action in the future. Oh, and please hit the subscribe button and the little notification bell beside it to get notified when the next video comes out, and do come check my website, theelectricluthier.com, with plenty of articles on guitar building and more related stuff. I noticed that my bridge is totally flat and the D and G strings are pretty much touching the last few frets, and both the high and the low E's have a gap. So the first thing I'll do is adjust the bridge radius. In order for the strings to keep a consistent distance from the frets, they need to be parallel to the fretboard and therefore have the same radius at both the nut and the bridge end. You can use the same radius gauge I used when routing the fretboard and press it from above to see which strings need adjustment. Another type of radius gauge is the T-style one. This one can be inserted under the strings and will allow for a more comfortable adjustment. At the moment, my bridge is totally flat. I'll first eyeball the E strings to a reasonable height, and then I'll raise the middle saddle quite a lot. I will also raise the inner part of the two other saddles to get a nice radius. Whether working from above or below, aside from sight, you can pluck each string and see if it buzzed on the radius gauge. When all 6 buzz similarly without applying pressure on the gauge, you should have the right radius. If you're checking from the top, it should seem like the low E string is a bit higher because the measurement of the distance is from the bottom of the string and the lower strings are thicker. Just make sure the correct radius spans between the high E and the low E strings. Tuning your guitar doesn't necessarily mean it will stay in tune over the whole fretboard. And if you've ever felt your higher notes were a bit off despite the guitar being in tune, the intonation may be the cause. There needs to be a slight compensation with any scale length for any single string to maintain the correct pitch in the high notes as well as the lower ones. And no, this has nothing to do with a multi-scale guitar. There are 2 ways to listen to the intonation, and they both work. For each string, you can compare an open string and the 1 octave up at the 12th fret. Or play the 12th fret and then the 12th fret overtone. In both cases, you're looking to see or hear if the second one is relatively flat or sharp. If you're using the open string, there will be, of course, an octave of difference, but it's still the same note. Some people have absolute hearing, and this will just ring out to them and be very obvious. Those of us who are used to tune a guitar from a tuning fork and not a digital tuner are used to listening for that slight difference. But if you're not, you can use a tuner as well. The fancier and more accurate your tuner is, the better the results. My under $10 headstock tuner confirms what my ears are hearing. If If the second one is sharper than the first tone, we want to make up for it by making the string a bit longer, and therefore we will want to move the bridge saddle away from the nut. If the second note is flat, you will want to shorten your string and move your saddle towards the nut. The only tool you need for most fenders is a small Phillips screwdriver. I also keep a small Allen key in case I want to make some height adjustments for any buzzing. You can do all of this under tension. The difference is smaller than half a tone, so it cannot do any more harm to the strings or neck than your average string bend. It is also preferable to do it in a playing position to compensate for gravity and all of that. Of course, after each adjustment, you will want to retune the string, as any movement of the saddle will change it. Just go string by string and check them. 6 saddles are probably easier to adjust and will deliver more precise results, but in most cases of these vintage bridges, you can still make it work. We're pretty much done. It looks like we had a pretty smooth build, but as I mentioned in the first part of the build, errors happened and mistakes were made. Join me next time when I cover everything that went wrong and how I fixed it. Professional luthiers are those who have already made the mistakes, fixed them, and learned from them. With experience, you learn to avoid the beginner mistakes and deal with whatever else happens. The more you challenge yourself, the more mistakes you'll have to learn from. So I'll be sharing my own so you won't have to make them. Until then, if you want information about building electric guitars, articles, and more, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell button to get notified, check out the links below, and come visit us at theelectricluthier.com.